I thank very much for the opportunity to speak here in Sydney, and you will excuse me for my English because it's very deficient, but I will try the best. Louder? Okay. Well, apropos of cinema and images in general, media images, technological images, I would like to conjure up the perversity of a relation between the image and its referent, the supposed real, the virtual and irreversible confusion of a sphere of images and the sphere of a reality whose nature we are less and less able to grasp. There are many modalities of this absorption, this confusion, this diabolical seduction of images. Above all, it's the reference principle of images which must be doubted. This strategy by means of which they always appear to refer to a real world, to real objects, and to reproduce something which is logically and chronologically anterior to themselves. None of this is true. As simulacra, images precede the real to the extent that they invert the causal and logical order of the real and its reproduction. Benjamin, in his essay, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, already pointed out strongly this modern revolution in the order of production, of reality, of meaning, by the precision, the anticipation of its reproduction. It's precisely when it appears most truthful, most faithful, and most in conformity to reality that the image is most diabolical. And our technical images, whether they be from photography, cinema, or television, are in the overwhelming majority much more figurative, realist than all the images from past cultures. It is in its resemblance, not only analogical, but technological, that the image is most immoral and most perverse. The appearance of the mirror already introduces into the world of perception an ironical effect of trompe-l'œil, and we know what malefice was attached to the appearance of doubles. But this is also true of all the images which surround us. In general, they are analyzed according to their value as representations, as media of presence and meaning. The immense majority of present-day photographic, cinematic, and television images are thought to bear witness to the world with a naive resemblance and a touching fidelity. We have spontaneous confidence in their realism. We are wrong. They only seem to resemble things, to resemble reality, events, faces, or rather, they really do conform, but their conformity itself is diabolical. We can find a sociological, historical, and political equivalent to this diabolical conformity, to this evil demon of conformity, in the modern behavior of the masses, who are also very good at complying with the models offered to them, who are very good at reflecting the objectives imposed on them, thereby absorbing and annihilating them. There is in this conformity a force of seduction in the literal sense of the word, a force of diversion, distortion, capture, and ironic fascination. There is a kind of fatal strategy of conformity. A recent example may be found in Woody Allen's film, Zelig. In trying to be oneself, to cultivate difference and originality, one ends up resembling everyone and no longer seducing anyone. This is the logic of present-day psychological conformity. Zelig, on the other hand, is launched on an adventure of total seduction, in an involuntary strategy of global seduction. He begins to resemble everything which approaches him, everything which surrounds him. Nor is this the mimetic violence of defiance or parody. It is the mimetic non-violence of seduction. To begin to resemble the other, to take on their appearance, is to seduce them, since it's to make them enter the realm of metamorphosis despite themselves. This seductive force, this fatal strategy, is a kind of animal genie or talent, not simply that of the chameleon, which is on its anecdotal form. It's not the conformism of animals which delights us. On the contrary, animals are never conformist, they are seductive. They always appear to result from a metamorphosis, precisely because they are not individuals. They pose the enigma of their resemblance. If an animal knows how to conform, it's not to its own being, its own individuality. That's a banal strategy. But to appearances in the world. This is what Selig does too with his animal genie. He's polymorphous, but not perverse. He's incapable of functional adaptation to his contexts, which is true conformism, our conformism, but able to seduce but the play of resemblance. Savages do not less when they put on the successive mask of the gods, when they become their successive divinities. This is also to seduce them. It is, of course, against this strategy of seduction that psychiatry struggles, and it is what gives rise to the magical infatuation of the crowds for Selig. In German, Selig means blessed. The remarkable thing in this film is that it leads astray all possible interpretations. There is thus also a seduction of interpretation, with the complicity of certain intellectuals, as well as polymorphous montage technique which allows it to ironically adapt to all possibilities. More generally, the image is interesting not only in its role as reflection, mirror, representation of or counterpart to the real, but also when it begins to contaminate reality and to model it. When it only conforms to reality, the better to distort it, or better still, when it appropriates reality for its own ends, when it anticipates it to the point that the real no longer has time to be produced as such. It's not only daily life which has become cinematographic or televisual, but war as well. It had been said that war is the continuation of politics by other means. We can also say that images, media, images, have a continuation of war by other means. Take Apocalypse Now. Coppola made his film the same way the Americans conducted the war. In this sense, it is the best possible testimony. With the same exaggeration, the same excessive means, the same monstrous candor, and the same success. War is a trip, a technological psychedelic fantasy. War as a succession of special effects. The war became film well before it was shot. War replaced by technological testing. For me, Americans, it was above all the latter, a test site, an enormous field on which to test their weapons, their methods, their power. Coppola does the same thing. He tests the power of intervention of cinema, tests the impact of cinema become a vast machine of special effects. In this sense, his film is very much the prolongation of war by other means, the completion of that incomplete war, its apotheosis. War becomes film, film becomes war, the two united by their mutual overflow of technology. The real war was conducted by Coppola in the matter of Westmoreland, leaving aside the clear irony of napalming Filipino forests and villages to recreate the hell of South Vietnam. Everything is replayed, begun again through cinema. The Moroccan joy of the shoot, the sacrificial joy of so many millions spent, of such an holocaust of means, of so many difficulties, and the dazzling paranoia in the mind of the creator, who from the beginning conceived this film as a world historical event for which the Vietnam War would have been no more than a pretext, would ultimately not have existed, and we cannot deny it. We cannot deny it. In itself, the Vietnam War never happened. Perhaps it was only a dream, a baroque dream of napalm in the tropics, and psychotropic dream in which the issue was not politics or victory, but the sacrificial, excessive deployment of a power already filming itself as it unfolds, perhaps expecting nothing more but consecration by a super film which perfects the war function as a mass spectacle. No real distance, no critical direction, no desire for any raised consciousness in relation to the war. In a sense, this is the brutal quality of the film, not to be undermined by any anti-war moral psychology. Coppola may very well dress up his helicopter captain in a cavalry hat and have him wipe out a Vietnamese village to the sound of Wagner. They are not critical, distant signs. They are immersed in the machinery, part of a special effect. Coppola makes films in the same manner, with the same nostalgic megalomania, with the same non-signifying fury, the same magnified Punch and Judy effect. One can ask, how is such an horror possible? Not the war, properly speaking, but that of the film. But there is no response, no possible judgment. The Vietnam War and the film are cut from the same cloth. Nothing separates them. This film is part of the war. If the Americans apparently lost the other, they have certainly won this one. Apocalypse Now is a global victory. It has a cinematographic power equal and superior to that of the military and industrial complexes of the Pentagon and governments. Nothing is understood in relation to war or cinema, at least the latter, unless one has grasped this indistinguishability, which is not the ideological or moral indistinguishability of good and evil, but that of the reversibility of destruction and production, of the immanence of something in its very revolution, of the organic metabolism of every technology from carpet bombing to film stock. As for the anticipation or reality by images, the precession of images and media in relation to events, such that the connection between cause and effect becomes scrambled, that it becomes impossible to tell which is the effect of the other. What better example than the nuclear accident at Harrisburg, a real incident which happened just after the release of China Syndrome. This film is a fine example of a supremacy of a televised event over the nuclear event, which itself remains improbable and in some sense imaginary. Moreover, the film unintentionally shows this. It is the intrusion of TV into the reactor which, as it were, triggers the nuclear incident, because it is the anticipation and model of it in the day-to-day world. Television of the real and of the real world, because TV and information in general are a kind of catastrophe in Ronnie Tom's formal topological sense, a radical qualitative change in entire system. Or rather, TV and nuclear power are of the same kind. Behind the hot and negantropic concepts of energy and information, they have the same dissuasive force as cold systems. TV is also a nuclear chain reactive process, but implosive. It cools and neutralizes the meaning and energy of events. Thus, behind the presumed risk of explosion, that is of hot catastrophe, the nuclear conceals a long, cold catastrophe, the universalization of a system of dissuasion, of deterrence. The homology between nuclear power and television can be read directly in the images. Nothing resembles the command and control center of a reactor more than the TV studios, and the nuclear consoles share the same imaginary as the recording and broadcasting studios. Everything happens between these two poles. The other core, that of the reactor, in principle the real core of the affair, remains concealed from us, like the real, buried and undecipherable, ultimately of no importance. The drama is acted out on the screens and nowhere else. Harrisburg, Watergate, and Network from a trilogy of China syndrome, an inextricable trilogy in which we cannot tell which is the effect of a symptom of the others. Is the ideological argument, this is the Watergate effect, only the symptom of the nuclear, this is the Harrisburg effect, or the informational model, the network effect? Is the real, that is Harrisburg, only the symptom of the imaginary, network or China syndrome, or vice versa? Marvelous indistinguishability, ideal constellation of simulation. The conjunction of the China syndrome and Harrisburg haunts us, but it is so involuntary. Without examining any magical links between simulacrum and reality, it's clear that the China syndrome is not unrelated to a real accident at Harrisburg, not by causal logic, but by those relations of contagion and unspoken analogy which link the real models and simulacra. The induction of nuclear incident at Harrisburg by the film corresponds with disquieting obviousness to the induction of the incident by TV in the film. A strange precession of a film before the real, the most astonishing we have seen. Reality corresponded point by point to the simulacra, even down to a suspensive, incomplete character of a catastrophe, which is essential from a point of view of dissuasion. The real so arranged itself in the image of the film to produce a simulation of catastrophe. It's only a further step which we would briskly take to reverse our logical order and see the China syndrome as the real event and Harrisburg its simulacrum. For it is by the same logic that the nuclear reality in the film follows from the television effect and that Harrisburg in reality follows from the cinema effect of the China syndrome. But the latter is not the original prototype of Harrisburg. One is not the simulacrum and the other the reality. There are only simulacra. And Harrisburg is a kind of simulation in the second degree. There is indeed a chain reaction, but it's not the nuclear chain reaction. It's the chain reaction of simulacra and of the simulation in which all the energy of the real is effectively engulfed, not in a spectacular nuclear explosion, but in a secret and continuous implosion, which is perhaps taking a more deadly turn than all the explosions which presently lull us. For an explosion is always a promise. It is our hope. See how much in the film, as well as at Harrisburg, everyone expects it to go up, that destruction speak its name and deliver us from the unnameable panic, from this invisible nuclear panic of dissuasion. Let the core of the reactor explode at last, its growing power of destruction. Let it reassure us as to the admittedly catastrophic presence of energy and gratify us with the spectacle. For the problem is that there is no nuclear spectacle, no spectacle of nuclear energy in itself. Hiroshima is past. It is for this reason that it's rejected. It would be perfectly accepted if it lended itself to spectacle like earlier forms of energy, parousia of catastrophe, substantial boast to our messianic libido. But that will never occur. What will happen will never be explosion but implosion. Never again will we see energy in a spectacular and pathetic form. All the romanticism of explosion, which had so much charm, since it was also that of revolution, but only the cold energy of simulacra and its distillation in homeopathic doses into the cold systems of information. What else does the media dream of, if not raising up events by its very presence? Everyone deplores it, but everyone is secretly fascinated by this eventuality. Such is the logic of simulacra. No longer divine predestination, but the precession of models which is no less inexorable. And it is for this reason that events no longer have any meaning, not because they are insignificant in themselves, but because they are being preceded by models which with their own process can only coincide. For some time now, in the dialectical relation between reality and images, that we wish to believe dialectical, that is readable from the real into the image and vice versa. The image has taken over and imports its own immanent ephemeral logic, an immoral logic without depth, beyond good and evil, beyond truth and falsity, a logic of the extermination of its own referent, a logic of the implosion of meaning in which the message disappears on the horizon of a medium. In this regard, we all remain incredibly naive. We always look for a good usage of the image, that is to say, a moral, meaningful, pedagogic, or informational usage, without seeing that the image, in a sense, revolts against this good usage. That is, the conductor neither of meaning nor good intentions, but on the contrary of an implosion, a denegation of meaning, or of events, or history, of memory, and so on. I'm reminded of Holocaust, the television series on the concentration camps. Forgetting the extermination is part of the extermination itself. That forgetting, however, is still too dangerous and must be replaced by an artificial memory. Everywhere today, it is artificial memories which obliterate people's memories, which obliterate people from memory. This artificial memory will replace the extermination, but too late for it to profoundly unsettle anything. And above all, it does so via a medium which is itself cold, radiating oblivion, dissuasion and extermination in an even more systematic manner, if it is possible, than the camps themselves. TV is the veritable final solution to the historicity of every event. The Jews are recycled not through the crematory ovens of the gas chambers, but through the soundtracks and images, through the cathode tube and the microchip. Forgetting, annihilation thereby achieve at last an aesthetic dimension. Nostalgia gives them their final finish. Henceforth, everyone knows, everyone has trembled before the extermination, a sure sign that it will never happen again. But in effect, what is thus exercised so cheaply at the cost of a few tears will never recur, because it's presently happening in the very form through which it's denounced, through the very medium of this supposed exorcism, television. The same process of forgetting, of liquidation, of extermination, the same annihilation of memories and of history, the same inverse implosive radiation, the same absorption without trace, the same black hole as Auschwitz. They want us to believe that TV will remove the mortgage of Auschwitz by raising collective consciousness, whereas it is the perpetuation of it in a different guise, under the auspices not of a site of annihilation, but a medium of dissuasion. What everyone fails to understand is that Holocaust is above all and exclusively a televised event, or as a televised object. That's McLuhan's fundamental rule, which must not be forgotten. That's to say, it's an attempt to create a cold historical event, tragic but cold, the first great event of cold systems, those cooling systems of dissuasion and extermination, which were subsequently deployed in other forms, including the Cold War and so on, and in relation to the cold masses. The Jews, no longer even concerned by their own death, eventually self-managing it, no longer even masses in revolt, dissuaded unto death, dissuaded even of their own death, to create this cold event via a cold medium, television, for masses who are themselves cold, who will only find in it the occasion for a tactile chill and a posthumous emotion, a dissuasive shiver, which sends them into oblivion with a kind of aesthetic good face. The cold light of television is inoffensive to the imagination, even that of children, since it no longer carries any imaginary, for the simple reason that it's no longer an image. In this sense, the TV image has to be placed in opposition with the cinema, which still carries an intense imaginary. Also, it's more contaminated more and more by the TV. The cinema is still an image. That means not only a screen and a visual form, but a myth, something that belongs to the sphere of the double, the phantasm, for the mirror of a dream, and so on. Nothing of that in the TV image, which doesn't suggest anything and has a magnetic effect. The TV image is only a screen, more than that, a miniaturized terminal located in your head, and you have a screen, and the TV does look at you, goes through you like a magnetic tape, and not an image. Thus, properly speaking, it's Holocaust, the television film, which constitutes the definitive Holocaust event. Likewise, with The Day After, another film, it's not the atomic conflict depicted in the film, but the film itself, which is the catastrophic event. This film should inspire a salutary terror. It should dissuade the spectacle of terror. However, I don't see anything as a result of this film. The slides of the New York Museum of Natural History move me much more profoundly. You can shiver at the Ice Age and feel charm of the prehistoric, but here, in The Day After, I feel neither the shiver nor the charm of nuclear power, nor even suspense, nor the final blinding flash. Is it a bad film? Certainly. But isn't it rather that all this is unimaginable? Isn't it rather that in our imaginary, nuclear conflict is a total event without appeal and with no tomorrow? Whereas it simply brings about a regression of the human race according to the worst naive stereotypes of savagery. But we already know that state. Indeed, we have barely left it. Our desire is rather for something which no longer takes place on a human scale, for some anterior or ulterior mystery. What will the earth be like when we are no longer on it? In a word, we dream of our disappearance and of seeing the world in its inhuman purity, which is precisely not the state of nature. But these limits, these extremes that we imagine, this catastrophe, can it be metaphorized in images? It's not certain that its mythical revocation is possible, any more than that our biomolecular destiny or that of the genetic code, which is the other dimension, the corollary of the nuclear. We can no longer be affected by it, proof that we are already being irradiated. Already to our minds, the catastrophe is no more than a comic strip. Its filmic projection is only a diversion from the real nuclearization of our lives. The real nuclear catastrophe has already happened. It happens every day, and this film is a part of it. It is it which is our catastrophe. It does not represent it. It does not evoke it. On the contrary, it shows that it has already happened, that it is already here, since it's impossible to imagine. For all these reasons, I do not believe in a pedagogy of images, nor of cinema, nor a fortiori in one of television. I don't believe in a dialectic between image and reality, nor therefore in respect of images in a pedagogy of message and meaning. The secret of the image, we are still speaking of contemporary technical images, actually. must not be sought in its differentiation from reality and hence its representative value, aesthetic, critical, or dialectical value, but on the contrary in its telescoping into reality, its short circuit with reality, and finally in the implosion of image and reality. For us, there is an increasingly definitive lack of differentiation between image and reality, which no longer leaves room for representation as such. This collusion between images and life, between the screen and daily life, can be experienced every day in the most ordinary manner. Especially in America, not the least charm of which is that even outside the cinemas, the whole country is cinematographic. You cross the desert as if in a western. The metropolis is a continual screen of signs and formulae. Life is a traveling shot, a kinetic cinematographic sweep. There is as much split in this as in those Dutch or Italian towns where, upon leaving the museum, you rediscover a town is the very image of the paintings, as if it had stepped out of them. It is a kind of miracle which, even in a banal American way, gives rise to a sort of aesthetic form, to an ideal confusion which transfigures life as in a dream. Here, cinema does not take on an exceptional form of a work of art, even a brilliant one, but invests the whole of life with a musical ambience. Here it becomes truly exciting. This is why the idolatry of stars, the cult of Hollywood idols, is not a media pathology, but a glorious form of cinema, its musical transfiguration, perhaps the last great mass of our modernity. Precisely to the extent that the idol no longer represents anything, but reveals itself as a pure, impassioned, contagious image, which effaces the difference between the real being and its assumption into the imaginary. All these considerations are a bit wild, but it is because they correspond to the unrestrained film buff that I am and have always wished to remain. That is, in a sense, uncultured and fascinating. There is a kind of primal pleasure, of anthropological joy in images, a kind of brute fascination unencumbered by aesthetic, moral, social, or political judgments. It's because of this that I suggest they are immoral, and that their fundamental power lies in this immorality. This brute fascination for images, above and beyond all moral and social determination, is also not that of dreaming or the imaginary, understood in the traditional sense. Other images, such as those in painting, drawing, theater, or architecture, have been better able to make us dream or imagine. Other modes of expression as well, undoubtedly, language makes us dream better than the image. So there is something more than that which is peculiar to our modern media images. If they fascinate us so much, it's not because they are sight of the production of meaning and representation. This would not be new. It's on the contrary because they are sights of the disappearance of meaning and representation. Sights in which we are caught quite apart from any judgment or of reality. They're sights of a fatal strategy of denegation of the real and of the reality principle. We have arrived at a paradox regarding the image, our image, those which unfurl upon and invade our daily life. Images whose proliferation, it should be noted, is potentially infinite, whereas the extension of meaning is always limited precisely by its end, by its finality. From the fact that images ultimately have no finality and proceed by total contiguity, infinitely multiplying themselves according to an irresistible epidemic process which no one today can control, our world has become truly infinite. or rather exponential, but by means of images. It is caught up in a mad pursuit of images, in an ever greater fascination which is only accentuated with video and digital images. We have thus come to the paradox that these images describe the equal impossibility of the real and of the imaginary. For us, the medium, the image medium, has imposed itself between the real and the imaginary, upsetting the balance between the two with a kind of fatality which has its own logic. I call this a fatal process in the sense that there is a definitive immanence on the image, without any possible transcendent meaning, without any possible dialectic or history. Fatal also in the sense not merely of an exponential linear unfolding of images and messages, but of an exponential unfolding of the medium around itself. The fatality lies in this endless enwrapping of images, literally without end, without destination, which leaves images no other destiny than images. The same thing happens everywhere today, when production has no destiny apart from production, overdetermination of production by itself, when sex has no destiny other than sex, sexual overdetermination of sexuality. This process may be found everywhere today, for better and for worse. In the absence of rules of the game, things become caught up in their own game. Images become more real than the real. Cinema itself becomes more cinema than cinema, in a kind of vertigo in which, to return to our initial problem, that of resemblance, it does no more than resemble itself and escape in its own logic, in the very perfection of its own model. I am thinking of those exact, scrupulous set pieces such as Chinatown, The Day of the Condor, Barry Lyndon, Other President's Men, the very perfection of which is disturbing. It is as if we were dealing with perfect remakes, with extraordinary montages, which belong more to a combinatory process or mosaic in the McLuhan's sense, with large photo, kino, or historiosynthetic machines, rather than with real films. Let's be clear, their quality is not in question. The problem is rather that they leave us somehow totally indifferent. Take the last picture show. You need only be sufficiently distracted, as I was, to see it as a 1950s original production, a good film of manners and the ambience of small-town America and so on. A slight suspicion. It was a little too good, better adjusted, better than the others, without the sentimental, moral, or psychological tics of the film of that period. Astonishment as that the discovery that it is a 1950s film, no, 1970s film, perfectly nostalgic, brand new, retouched, and hyper-realist restitution, those of the period, of the restitution of a 50s film. There is talk of remaking silent films, doubtless better than those of the period. A whole generation of films is appearing, which will be to those we have known what the android is to man. Marvelous, flawless artifacts, dazzling simulacras which lack only an imaginary and that particular hallucination which makes cinema what it is. Most of those, what we see today, the best, are already of this order. Barry Lyndon is the best example. No better has been made, no better will be made, but what exactly? Evocation, not even evocation, but simulation. All the toxic radiation has been filtered out. All the ingredients are present in precise doses, not a single mistake. Cool, cold pleasure, which is not even aesthetic, properly speaking, functional pleasure, equational pleasure, pleasure of imagination. We need only think of Visconti, the leopard, sense, and so on, which recall Barry Lyndon in certain respects, in order to grasp the difference, not only in style, but in the cinematographic act. With Visconti, there is meaning, a story, a sensual rhetoric, deed moments, a passionate game, not only in the historical content, but in the direction of film. None of that with Kubrick, who controls his film like a chessboard and makes his story in a personal scenario. Nor does this refer back to the old opposition between finesse and geometry. Their meaning was still in play, meaning was at stake, whereas we are entering into an era of films which no longer have meaning, properly speaking, large synthetic machines with variable geometry. Is there already something of this in Sergio Leone Western, perhaps? Yeah. All registers tend in this direction. Chinatown is a detective story redesigned by laser. It's not really a question of perfection. Technical perfection can belong to the meaning, and in this case, it is neither nostalgic nor hyperrealist. It's an effect of art. Here, it's an effect of model. It's one of the tactical reference values. In the absence of any real syntax of meaning, there are only tactical values in a complex world in which, for example, the CIA has an all-purpose mythological machine, Robert Redford as a polyvalent star, social relations as necessary references to history, and technical virtuosity as a necessary reference to cinema are all admirably combined. Cinema and its trajectory, from the most fantastic or mythical to the realistic and hyper-realistic. In its present endeavors, cinema increasingly approaches with ever-increasing perfection absolute reality. In its banality, in its veracity, in its starkness, in its stadium, and at the same time in its pretentiousness, in its pretension to be the real, the immediate, the unsignified, which is the maddest of enterprises, in the same way that the pretension of functionalist design to design it as the highest degree of the object, the form in which it coincides with its function, its use value, is properly as an insane enterprise. No culture has ever had this naive and paranoiac, this puritanical and terrorist vision of science. Terrorism is always of the real, simultaneous with this attempt at absolute coincidence with the real. Cinema also approaches an absolute coincidence with itself. This is not contradictory. It's the very definition of the hyperreal, hypotyposis and specularity. Cinema plagiarizes and copies itself, remakes its classics, retroactivates its original myth, remakes silent films more perfect than the originals, and so on. All this is logical. Cinema is fascinated by itself as a lost object, just as it is, and we are fascinated by the real as a referential in perdition. Previously, there was a living, dialectical, full and dramatic relationship between cinema and the imaginary. It is a novelistic, musical unreality, even down to the delirious use of its own technique. Today, there is an inverse, negative relation between the cinema and reality. It results from the loss of specificity which both have suffered. Cold college, cool promiscuity, asexual engagement of two cold media which evolve in asymptotic line towards one another. Cinema attempting to abolish itself in the absolute of reality, the real already long absorbed in cinematographic or televised hyperreality. I thank you very much.